Good evening, everyone. Glad that you're here. I'm here with Colonel Daniel Roper to talk about his presentation, Message from Mogadishu, the Deadly Downfalls of Mission Creep, which is based on an article that he wrote for Army Magazine in September 2023. His article was the winner of the 2023 Army Historical Foundation Distinguished Writing Award. Colonel, I'd like to ask you, what was the genesis of your article?
Thank you, Matt. Happy to be here and happy to discuss this very interesting spot in time that I think we can still be learning from today. In the summer of a couple of years ago, we were looking at for an opportunity to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Battle of Mogadishu, and looking at how we can take 3 decades of experience that have happened since then to put it in better context. Because when we all first learned about the battle on October 4th of 1993, it was very vivid in everybody's face, and it was something that everybody struggled to understand how the situation occurred, how did we get into it, and what led up to it. So on top of that professional and personal curiosity, AUSA, the Association of the United States Army, received a copy of a memorandum that was written by Major General David Meade just 3 weeks before the Battle of Mogadishu occurred, while he was in Somalia visiting a number of his troops who ultimately participated in that fight. We figured that inside context would give us another angle, or potentially we'd learn something from what was going on from one other professional who wrote it down. It was a classified document, so nobody saw it for a while, and then it was declassified. And this gave us one more snapshot that we thought ought to be put out into the record and for the discourse, so we can all learn from it, because there's still a lot that I think we can tap into.
Okay, Colonel, you could take about 15 to 20 minutes to talk about, walk us through the U.S. Army's experience in Somalia in 1992-93, to include the events that led up to the battle, and as well as the consequences that followed. Following your presentation, I have a few questions for you, and then we can discuss before opening up the Q&A for the audience.
Sounds good, Matt. What I'd like to run through sort of at a wave top level, but just kind of tell the story of it, as opposed to just looking at an 18-hour battle and trying to guess everything just based on that. What I'd like to talk about is what we saw that day. So when did the U.S. public and the U.S. military community get interested in the Battle of Mogadishu, and what did it mean? And to do so, it's necessary to put it into broader context on what was going on globally, and on what was happening both with the U.S. Army and what was happening in Somalia. And then we'll walk through how the U.S. and the UN each got involved in a complementary effort, and then very briefly touch upon the battle itself. The purpose in writing this article was not to relitigate or reassess what occurred in the battle, other than where it fits in the broader context of what it means today. But we will talk about the outcomes and the consequences, and then what are the implications? Is it just an interesting historical event that has no relevance, or is it relevant? And I think as we go through this, my intent is to kind of connect the dots on some things that there's an arc to this piece of history, and we're still on it. So I think it behooves all of us to pay attention to that. So what I'd like to briefly describe is what we saw that day, what we saw on the evening news, repeated over and over, and what caught America's attention. There were 18 U.S. soldiers killed in this basically 15 to 18-hour battle. There were 73 U.S. soldiers wounded. There were dead soldiers being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu who who were killed in that battle, the United States prisoner of war, and America and the U.S. military were dumbfounded. Just how did this happen? And many people didn't understand that we were in Somalia at all, although there was some recognition that the U.S. was part of an effort to address a massive famine that was going on in Somalia that had killed close to 500,000 people and it displaced 1.5 million people as refugees. So that's where everybody's intense interest in this began. But you can't just look at that and figure out the whole story. So like I said, it was broadening the aperture. So what had gone on in the several years prior to the Battle of Mogadishu were very significant geopolitically. We saw the winding down of the Cold War. And that's, again, we're saying that in retrospect. It did not necessarily feel like we were seeing the winding down of the Cold War. We were kind of seeing part of the world fall apart. And that part of the world controlled the bulk of the nuclear weapons. So it may look a little neat in history, but it was a little more vivid and gut-wrenching at the time. So in 1989, we saw the Soviet Union leave Afghanistan after 10 frustrating years in failure. About 6 months later, we saw the Berlin Wall come down, bringing back together West Germany and East Germany, and more importantly, Western Europe and Eastern Europe, as the Warsaw Pact was starting to crumble. And the Christmas of 1991 was the end of the Soviet Union. We see the picture on the right of the Soviet Union flag coming down for the last time and the ascension of the Russian flag. So in that little snapshot, okay, it sort of looks like we, not just the US, but the West prevailed in the Cold War. So that's clearly a very upbeat kind of occasion, and it kind of lended to some enthusiasm and some optimism. Excellent. In that same time frame, the U.S. and the U.S. military led a coalition that kicked Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait after he had illegally invaded it, and did so in a very convincing, decisive fashion, and actually did so on television in real time for much of it. And it demonstrated the extreme proficiency of the United States military and its coalition partners. And it wasn't just, their alleged proficiency was not just something that briefed well or sounded well. It really did happen in front of the world. And it convinced pretty much anybody that was paying attention that conventional combat against the United States military and its friends and partners is a really bad idea. So again, the next slide, there was a degree of confidence that came out of that, where one could say, and there were many articles written about this, the US was in a unipolar moment, and the globe was in a unipolar moment, where there was one clearly dominant superpower economically, militarily, in manners that were undisputed, whereas as of a few years prior, that might not have been necessarily the case. So the U.S. military and the U.S. people who had been paying for the U.S. military all this time was an interest in reaping the peace dividend. To kind of cut to the chase, some people are thinking there are no more bad guys, and if there any of them are out there, that they would be sane enough not to attack the U.S. military or do something that would compel the U.S. military to act upon them. But you could also say there was probably a sense of overconfidence and hubris. It's not necessarily stated, not necessarily arrogant, but there was a gradually, I'd say, an ascending feeling amongst the people that, okay, we dodged a bullet with the Soviet Union, and thank goodness they never went nuclear, and thank goodness we were starting to get control of the loose nukes, although that's never guaranteed. But again, bottom line, a sense of confidence that things are going pretty well from this standpoint. So there isn't much to worry about. So we're going to drastically downsize our military. just speaking from the U.S. Army perspective, the U.S. Army had been about 780,000 soldiers at the end of the Cold War, and it was on a fast race to get down to 480,000, which is a drastic, not just numbers, but repositioning, bringing forces back from Europe and the Pacific that had been there for 40 or 50 years. Next slide, please. Now let's briefly talk about Somalia and just address, that's where it is on the map, the Horn of Africa in the east, near the Bab el-Mandeb water passageway and the Red Sea. It's and just drilling down to the right, just to show you where Mogadishu is, because that's the part of Somalia we'll be discussing. The country is, much of it is arid, it's rough terrain, it's a difficult place to grow crops. It gets extreme weather, or extreme heat, put it that way, that makes it challenging for the crops, and has not been a stable place for a long time. Next slide. So we're really starting to get complicated is in 1991, Siad Barre, the president of Somalia, who'd been the president for over 20 years, was thrown out of office in a coup that was led by several rival clans that had been battling him for years, battling his government. The political instability was already there, and again, combined with a severe climate, the constant ongoing warfare led to a complete breakdown in government services and a civil war and a famine. And this is the famine I was referring to briefly before. About 500,000 people died, and had the refugees, and there was this feeling that somebody had to act. The UN had more freedom to act than it did during the Cold War, because there were constraints, whether they were from the West or from the Warsaw Pact, where it did not necessarily have a completely free hand. It now felt a little more empowered than it had previously. And as I mentioned, the US and its friends and partners and allies now had more latitude to do things because, okay, they're the superpower and there's no competition on the horizon. So we should be able to do this and use our military to support something that saves a large number of lives. So that was basically the precursor to the US and the UN getting involved. So in 1992, after Barre's out of office and again, civil war is blazing, the United Nations started a mission called United Nations Operations in Somalia, UNISOM. The United States supported UNISOM by Operation Provide Relief, which was airlift of critical humanitarian supplies into Somalia. And then in December, Operation Restore Hope expanded that, and it was to also protect the aid workers and humanitarian organizations, as they're the ones that are actually delivering the aid and the humanitarian service. And these efforts were partially successful, both on the US side and the UN side. They both, again, were starting to staunch the flow of the death and the reach of the famine. But this was in a significant part due to the fact that the warring clans sort of took a knee and just kind of backed away a little bit from what they'd been doing when the military forces from the UN and the US showed up. And the clans did not want to fight all these foreign invaders. So they just let them do their good works, and they were waiting for them to leave. And that soon became evident on a number of different fronts. Next slide, please. So the UNISOM mission transformed into UNITAF, which is the Unified Task Force mission, in late 92, December 92 exactly. And the UN legitimized it, the US supported it, and the mission was to start to secure the environment for the humanitarian efforts. The first phase in UNISOM was really just treating the symptoms, starving people, feeding starving people, giving medicine to sick people. which is obviously a very good thing to do, and it saves a lot of lives, but it doesn't have any sustaining power, and it doesn't address the root causes. The UNITAF mission started to look at going after the root causes by, again, trying to establish a secure environment, which is a little bit more of a lift than just handing somebody some food. And the warlords were using the delivery of food and aid as a weapon. They were interdicting it, they were stealing it, they were hoarding it in order to diminish the other warlords and to extend their own power. And probably foremost among all those warlords was Mohamed Farah Aidid. He's the leader of the Haber-Gitter subclan and the Somali National Alliance. And we'll talk about them as we move forward here. In May of '93, the mission transformed into UNISOM II, and just as the troop levels of the force, the UN and the US were being diminished, and the intent was more of a peacekeeping, peace enforcement mode, done more so by the US than by the other UN contingents. But by this time, the clans had lost their patience with the foreign invaders basically disrupting their opportunity to consolidate power now that Seed Bar was gone. And they wanted to take their shot at it. So just after UNISOM, a contingent of Pakistani peacekeepers who were inspecting an arms cache were attacked by the SNA forces and killed 24 Pakistani peacekeepers. That obviously was a significant uptick in the violence that had occurred. About a month later, UNISOM II forces, of which the US military was a major portion, got some intel that there was going to be an SNA leadership meeting that was planning to, what they were going to do to attack coalition forces. The US and the UNISOM forces attacked and killed 73 Somalis by the count that was independently verified by a couple of sources. The Somalis said those were innocent people that were there to plan humanitarian efforts and how they were going to reestablish some governance processes. The Americans and the others that were part of the attack on that site said that they had intel that was not the case. Nevertheless, the narrative that dominated within Somalia and clearly among the SNA was that was an unjustified attack. And again, hence called Bloody Monday, and was used as justification to motivate and to recruit additional members of their militia and to justify the attacks that were to come. About a month after that, 8th of August, 4 US military policemen were killed when they hit a mine, and it was absolutely evident that the SNA military, the SNA forces, were now deliberately attacking Americans and American forces, whereas previously they tended to shy away from attacking the Americans because they had better luck attacking the UN forces who were not quite as well equipped or quite as proficient. And then on the 22nd of August, Task Force Ranger was approved by President Clinton to deploy to Somalia as part of Operation Gothic Serpent, which was intended to kill or capture Mohamed Aidid, the leader of the SNA. And that brings us to the title of the article that we talked about, the memorandum from General Meade, who was the commanding general of the 10th Mountain Division at the time. And he was only on the ground for about 48 hours, but in those 48 hours, he saw a lot, and there was a lot going on, and he got the opportunity to talk to, obviously, his subordinate commanders that were part of the 10th Mountain Division, although they were there working for Task Force Ranger and UNISOM. he was able to paint a picture of what the situation looked like, and it should have been classified at the time. And in retrospect, you look at it now, and it's okay. We all now know all these things to be facts, but it was very insightful. And again, that's almost a starting point for why we wrote this article, just to commemorate the Battle of Mogadishu, because it was just sort of the absolute queuing up and teeing up of the evident truth on the ground. Excellent. So General Meade's memo, which was signed on the 15th of September, and it went to the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, it went to the U.S. Forces Commander, it went to the 18th Airborne Corps Commander, it went to the U.S. Deputy Commander of UNISOM Forces. Simultaneously, was his assessment was the war is not going well, and there's no reason to think that we're going to win it in the end. And he starts right out saying it's a war. It's not this gradual, smoothly labeled, peacefully labeled mission, whether it's being driven by the UN or the broader context. He was saying the United States is at war, and he's watching his soldiers at war. It's not just a humanitarian aid mission anymore. And his assumption was the end state is the same. The U.S. and the UN will not be in Somalia, and Somalia is going to revert to its natural character, meaning this is whatever conditions are changed by the presence of the U.S. and other forces. They are temporary, and there's not going to be anything enduring that comes of their activity. He described 3 courses of action that he discussed with a number of commanders on the ground, and were very evident to all that the U.S. military, or the U.S. itself, had 3 options. The first was send more force. And he said, this is the worst of all possible options, but it is an option. He said, probably put in a division-sized force to augment Task Force Ranger, and they could temporarily hold the ground just as long as they were there. It would make no meaningful change in the long run. The second course of action was continue what we're doing, which is not working well, and the trends are wrong, and it flirts with the disaster of a considerable proportion. Those are pretty alarming words for a commander to be sending to the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. That's where we are on this situation right now. And the third option was get out, and he said that's a terrible option, but it's the best of the options that we have. And it's the only way for the U.S. Armed Forces and the U.S. government to retain any initiative, is to take the initiative and get out of there. Do what it can to set some kind of transition conditions, but it's just flat out not going to work. And as I was reading through this, and probably read it a dozen times in the course of writing this article, it really echoed with Sun Tzu. And since we're talking to you from the Army Historical Foundation, this probably resonates with some of our listeners. But Sun Tzu, the Chinese military philosopher from about 300 BC, said, strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And what we're seeing is a situation where there was no overall cohesive strategy for what the U.S. and the UN would be doing in Somalia. And again, that's not a criticism, that's just a fact. That's a very murky, fuzzy situation that was changing. It had so many different dimensions to it that were not just military. And then we've got the U.S. military, elements of the 10th Mountain, and then Task Force Ranger on the ground executing tactics and doing the best they can. And ultimately, those tactics are not going to aggregate to meaningful results and have a strategic effect that benefit to the United States and its friends and partners. So just a brief laydown of the battle of Mogadishu, 13th and 14th just describe how operations were working once Task Force Ranger got on the ground. Task Force Ranger was comprised of 441 soldiers, comprised of Task Force 160th Special Ops Aviation, comprised of Special Operations Delta, known as Delta Force operators, company from the 75th Ranger Regiment, a couple Air Force and Navy SEAL paramilitary experts. And what this team did, primarily Task Force 160th and the Rangers, is they conducted raids, and they conducted pretty much the same raid each time. It was right out of their playbook. If a target was identified, they'd be flying helicopters all over the area of Mogadishu, where Aidid's forces and his militia were known to predominate. It was essentially their terrain, and so they conducted a lot of mock raids. They'd fly around and fake like they were going someplace just to keep the general population confused, and they wouldn't tip the hand if they went after a building. And you'll understand this in a moment. And their essence was absolute speed. They were light, they were fast, they were aggressive, and they were gone. And they did not bulk up with 3 days of supply of ammunition or a week's supply of water. They went in quick. They would identify a potential target based on intelligence sources. And the template for the mission was 4 special operations MH6 helicopters would bring in 4 teams of Delta operators right to the target, or as close as they could get to it. And they would either kill or capture whoever the intended target was and be ready for extraction. 4 teams of 4 squads, essentially, of Rangers would be in 4 MH-60 Blackhawks that would be on the next perimeter out. Look at it as a concentric circle, and then the next circle out to prevent any reinforcements from getting into helping out the target. And the plan on October 3rd, in this case, was for that to happen and for a convoy of vehicles to leave the Mogadishu airport, which was also the headquarters for Task Force Ranger, to help collect up the prisoners that were the designated targets on that day. 2 members of Aidid's militia, 2 of his senior leaders at the Olympic Hotel. And that's what we saw. And the key point on this, again, I'm just giving you a general overview. Each of the missions is different. Each of the 6 different raids that the Task Force Ranger conducted prior to that point in time, every single time they did, Aidid's militia and Aidid's military, they were watching, they were learning, they were adapting, and they were taking countermeasures. So whether it was developing the ability to rapidly in place an obstacle, whether it was developing the ability to set up an ambush, or developing an ability to, if they came in one way, they blocked their exit, they blocked the Task Force Rangers' exit, and also their own signaling apparatus using burning tires and a number of other factors. Each time they adapted, and each time they realized more and more that their key to success was to take down the helicopter, because the helicopters would come in extremely close, extremely aggressively, but they're extremely vulnerable at a certain point in time. And the speed that saved them is also the speed that kind of gets them into a little bit of trouble. And this is a brief glimpse of like I said, you can see the Olympic Hotel, which was the object that day. You see the scenes of the 2 helicopters, you see the locations. The first one was Super 6-1, a Blackhawk that went down about 40 minutes into the fight. And about 20 minutes after that, Super 6-4 went down after it was hitting the tail rotor with a rocket-propelled grenade. Tail rotor disintegrated, and the helicopter spun uncontrollably and crashed to the ground. In each of these crash scenes, we now had teams of Rangers and Delta Force operators rushing to those sites to secure those sites to try to save or treat any of the wounded or recover any of the killed. And at that, both sites had heavy fighting, and they ultimately wound up staying the entire night before they could get back out. We're running out of ammunition because they couldn't bring enough, and some ammunition was dropped in from other helicopters that came in at night. At the scene of Super 6-4, that was where the pilot, CW2 Mike Durant, was taken prisoner. It was a POW that the Somalis paraded in front of TV. Were using him in a manner that violates the code of conduct in war. And in the defense of his position, he was severely wounded, and he had two Delta operators in a helicopter were inserted to help get him out. At their insistence, they were told 2 times by the 2-star commanding general of Task Force Ranger, "You can't go in there. It's too dangerous. We can't even get you close, and you're outnumbered massively." And these 2 operators insisted. Finally, were put in, went to Durant, gave him a weapon that he could try to defend himself because he couldn't move because I think his back was broken at that point in time. And they ultimately lost their lives along with some other soldiers. And I'm going to talk about those guys in just a second. Next slide, please. So the macro numbers of this battle are the U.S. accomplished its objective. It just doesn't sound like I just described the mission where the U.S. accomplished its objective, but the mission was to capture 2 of Aidid's lieutenants. They ultimately were captured and brought out. They also had captured about 20 other members of the militia. So that was all in concert with the mission. But the cost was 18 U.S. soldiers killed, 73 U.S. soldiers wounded, 1 POW, and the cost more broadly was the parading of this on global television that absolutely caused huge issues, not just then, not just gut-wrenching issues for the people who lost somebody there, but in broader manner that you've got today. Next slide, please. A couple publications I'd offer that you may want to look into as far as getting into the nitty-gritty of what was happening, in addition to Black Hawk Down, which again that sort of started this conversation with the American public years ago. It's a great book. A couple others that have been out recently. There's a Medal of Honor series of graphic novels that's overseen at AUSA, and there's one on Master Sergeant Gary Gordon and Sergeant First Class Randy Shuga that were the 2 Delta operators that insisted that they went in to get Super 6-4 out. And in about 8 minutes, you can graphically get a visualization of what they were going through and get the guts of sort of like ground zero of what happened at the soldier level in the middle of that fight. And many people had many different vantage points. A good publication that came out about a year or 2 ago was With My Shield by Jim Lechner, who was a Ranger platoon leader in that fight. And that's somebody else that you ought to just kind of get perspectives from this. And another thing I'd offer out there, which again, just sort of anybody who wants to learn about this, there are a number of YouTube videos and other documentaries that are online comprised of soldiers that were in this fight, whether they were 160th, whether they were Rangers, whether they were Delta operators, and often they're discussing it amongst themselves. And you're watching real-time learning occur 30 years later. When somebody is describing something, says, "Well, that's when the grenade went through the window," and the other guy said, "No, that's after the door blew open." So they're kind of learning from each other decades later. So again, any new information is a good trigger for learning. And again, hence the memo that we were lucky enough to get from from General Meade, from General Meade's collection, adds to the mix here. Next slide, please. So the immediate aftermath was 3 days later, President Clinton announced that the U.S. is leaving Somalia. And again, that's by the 31st of March in 1994. But that there it was on global TV that we are leaving. Is some guy named bin Laden who's been in Sudan at this point in time because I think he'd been kicked out of his home country for some reason. And he's watching, and a lot of other people are watching. And bin Laden said that his perception was the feebleness displayed by the U.S. military. It fed his narrative of the United States is weak as a reluctant power. He was already emboldened by the notion that the Mujahideen had defeated the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And while they were the key tool and the driver of it, it was only with help from the United States, with the stingers and the other things that went along with that. But so right now, just if you kind of picture yourself and put yourself in his head for a moment, he thinks that what he's doing, the Mujahideen, and again, this is morphing into al-Qaida, as everybody knows, that they've already defeated the two world superpowers. They kicked the Soviet Union out, and it crumbled into a failed experiment. And now they just kicked the United States out of Somalia. And you can only speculate what kind of results that turns into. See that on the next slide, please. The United States Secretary of Defense resigned in December in 1994 while the genocide was occurring in Rwanda. Close to 1 million people died, and there was reluctance of any outside country to get involved. And part of it was due to the circumstances, how they had gone so badly in Somalia, not at that scale, but at how something, the good intention of trying to prevent a genocide could have a very adverse consequence. And there's a lot of documentation that would suggest that factored into the U.S. decision-making calculus in other countries as well. Then the blowing up of Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia in 96, the simultaneous embassy explosions in 97 in Africa, 2 different countries, the attack on the USS Cole in 2000, and ultimately the 9/11 attacks all have a clear nexus with al-Qaida and its various forms here. And they're all drawing strength in one manner or another by the outcome of the U.S. operation in Somalia in 93. And again, it's not always the true facts of the case. It's stuff that's extrapolated, but they're all data points that have fed the narrative that are with us today. Al-Qaida is morphed in a bunch of different forms. Next slide, please. And it's still with us, and it's got a global effect. And again, it's part of its DNA, not exclusively, but part of its DNA runs through this battle. So let's talk about some of the aside from what we've documented on what has actually occurred, what are some of the insights and implications that we can take that were reinforced in part by General Meade's memo, again, just to illuminate through a slightly different angle some of the things that went on in the battle. One is low tech does not mean incompetent. Low tech does not mean stupid. Low tech means low tech. So just because we may have the best tech or the highest tech does not necessarily mean that any potential adversary is just going to roll over and accept it. So that's a clear case of the most tactically proficient force in the world did the same thing often enough, and eventually the odds didn't go their way. From listening to the operators, they kind of had a suspicion that was happening. They could feel and sense that the enemy was kind of getting better every time. If you run the same football play every single time, eventually the defense is going to find a way to interdict it, and that's what happened. There's a fine line between boldness and initiative, and unacceptably high risk. And one can't always see it when it happens. They're usually over it when they realize, oh, that was the line, and that maybe have some relevance here. And something with some greatest strength can be its biggest vulnerability. So probably the greatest strength of that U.S. task force was its combined air-ground power enabled by the helicopters that enabled them to be lightning fast, to get the best warriors in the world anywhere they needed to, faster than anybody else could get them there. That also turned into a vulnerability when the first one got shot down and fixed the entire flow of movement. They lost their flexibility, lost the initiative. Next slide, please. Looking at this through the implications from a political and strategic context, people just need to understand that tactical military victory is not required to get strategic success. Vietnam is a well-known example of that, where the U.S. never lost tactically at any high significant level and did not win the war. The Vietnamese won the war. Somalia, another case where, again, this was technically a tactical victory, but it certainly did not aggregate the strategic success, because the United States was leaving 3 days after the battle was over with, or announced it was leaving. And military force is something that does not occur in isolation. It's done within political context, political constraints, and sometimes there may be what seem like arbitrary limitations on rules of engagement or troop levels or force disposition or other things like that. But the military has to remind itself that ultimately they're doing whatever they're doing, it's for a political purpose. And sometimes that doesn't necessarily make itself all that apparent. Another piece is aid and humanitarian assistance. They're not benign. They aren't just good on their own merits. It depends on how they're perceived, and they've got to be used wisely. And the donor of the aid is not necessarily the one who determines how it's received. In the case in 1993 in Somalia, Aidid was the guy that decided how that was going to be perceived and used that as a weapon system. And then imagery shapes the support forward against the use of military force. That's not news at all. Next slide, please. So the big takeaways from the battle, and again, there's lots of subsets to these, but it revealed the shortfalls in the U.S. assumptions on the use of force in the post-Cold War era, and transformed the strategic landscape and reverberates globally in ways that we still feel today. And it's sort of, some situations today have some DNA from what was going on in Somalia in 1993 and the conditions that led up to that. So that, again, there's a stream. It's not always the easiest to follow, but it's not just an aberration of something that happens with no prior cause and no run-on effect on that. And although tactically successful, the battle was a Pyrrhic victory, fought as part of Gothic Serpent. It's the bloodiest combat the U.S. military had experienced since the Vietnam War, and it really caught the attention of America. It absolutely did. And just trying to put the whole thing in context, there's a quote from William Faulkner who said, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." And that's a good thing to remind ourselves as we're thinking that, hey, thank goodness that won't happen again, whatever that happens to be. There's some underlying forces that suggest that it might. But that's the quick rundown of what we were thinking about. And what just became apparent is the more we dug into this and consulting different sources to try to help understand why that battle occurred and why the U.S. was in a situation that it had no idea it was ever going to get into.
Okay. Well, thank you. I have some questions. I'd like to throw out to you. The subtitle of your article in your presentation is Memo Highlights Deadly Downfalls of Mission Creep. Can you briefly discuss the meaning or origins of mission creep? I think some of our listeners or viewers might not quite have a grasp of as to what you mean by that.
In military terms, I mean, a unit gets assigned a mission, and it's to get to a certain place or accomplish a certain objective that may have some degree of ability to quantify it. And when a unit gets involved in a situation, they may see more opportunities to do other things and continue to raise the bar and say, if we can get to here, then we can get to here, we get to here. And it's not just as simple as doing this. Obviously, there are resources involved, there are trade-offs, there's risk. And sometimes militaries have found themselves going to a place to do something that may not be very intensive in fighting. In this case, humanitarian relief. So one visualizes trucks full of food and bags of flour and seeds and all the other things to feed starving people. And then it became, okay, we actually need to address these conditions, the underlying conditions, which are not primarily military conditions. They're political, they're economic, they're social, they're tribal dynamics. And okay, so is the military the best tool to solve that? No, but they're on the ground, so they start trying to fix that too when they're not equipped. And they may not have done the homework as well to prepare that. So it's just sort of continuing to try to do too many things. And escalation is exactly the dynamic that one sees until, again, they just cross the line they can't recover from.
Major General Meade's September 15th memo forms much of the basis of your article in the presentation. Who was it directed to? Is it a particular individual or the Pentagon?
It was a kind of a memorandum known as a P4, meaning personal 4. So it was personally directed to the Chief of Staff of the United States Army. And it had all his intermediate chain of command. Excuse me. And so it goes right to the top. But that's not the only thing that lands on the Chief of Staff of the Army's desk every day. But it was to kind of say, okay, this place is not what you think, and you need to know this now.
I think that's kind of a follow-up that I had to that was, was General Meade's memo somewhat ignored, and this would lead to the tragedy of October 3 and 4, 1993, or with the wheels already in motion with the deployment of Task Force Ranger that Gothic Serpent was inevitable.
I would suggest that it was well underway, and the order had already been given by the president with the support of the National Security Council. So it's hard to envision the Chief of Staff of the Army running to the Secretary of Defense and conducting the tank session with the Joint Chiefs that would be required to, again, recommend to the president that we change the mission. And it would be factored into it. And again, at any given point in time, there are lots of crises going on in the world. We do not all have visibility on what's happening behind it. So I think it was definitely informing his judgment. And Meade understood that because actually a few months before this, General Meade he was in the Pentagon, and he and I overlapped for about a week. But he was the guy that provided the policy advice to the chief of, through the 3-star to the Chief of Staff of the Army every time he walked into the tank, which is with a uniformed military, doesn't make decisions
it provides a recommendation to the Secretary of Defense. It ultimately turns into recommendations to the National Security Council. So Meade knew how that worked, and he knew all the buttons to push to get the attention as quickly as he possibly could. And I'm sure that generated a lot of energy and probably some people starting to say, okay, how do we do this? We can't just wave this memo around from Meade and the president's going to say, okay, leave now. And even if he said leave now, there's some laws of physics that get involved here. But I think it probably triggered that, but just wasn't quickly enough. And it was a very intractable situation, you could see.
Did you, as an active duty officer or working for AUSA, did you ever get a chance to speak with General Meade?
No, because he was literally on his way out the door when I came in as a little bitty captain right out of grad school. And he was in charge of all the strategy. And then he was off to go to 10th Mountain. But I mean, he had a reputation as being a very precise, insightful individual. And in one sense, he was pretty well prepared to put this in context because he had kind of been working at the higher level, the policy and strategy, which is all about context. And this was just, again, one data point that we've discovered that he had just getting sent up 3 weeks prior to this occurring. And like I said, to me, it's very difficult to see how that could change the course of the U.S. was on, and also the U.S. is over there with allies and partners, and it just does not make sense for it to just immediately cut and run. It may make sense for them to stop doing what they're doing, but I don't know if there's something else that we're going to find that says these are some actions that were taken, or here's where it stopped. I think it was too close to the inevitable. As task force rangers doing these missions and going after people, some of them were legitimately causing serious trouble. It could have been almost as dangerous just doing nothing at that point in time.
Again, I'm going back to the memo because I find this absolutely fascinating. Until I read your article, I'd never heard of it. I've read quite a bit about, Mogadishu, Somalia, anything. Were you really the first one to kind of write about this, or is there other studies out there?
All I've seen is we had published this in like August or September. I can't recall off the top of my head the article.
2020, September 2020.
Yeah, September, yeah, because we wanted to just get in front of the October anniversary. And the Mark Bowden, who wrote Black Hawk Down, wrote about it in his next regularly scheduled publication. I think he wrote about it in October, or it was published in October, which also makes sense. And he had received the same memo. So the individual that received the memo from General Meade used to work for General Meade. And his story was that General Meade sent it to him after he retired, and it was in a sealed envelope, and he sent it to the guy and just said, "Hold on to this for me, please," or something to that effect. After General Meade died, this former officer, retired officer, opened the memo, said, "This needs to be out there. People need to know about this." And I talked to him on the phone, the individual who was the recipient from General Meade of the memo. We spoke, and I don't know of anybody else that he sent it to except Bowden. So again, just reading between the lines here, I think this retired officer understood that the Association of the United States Army has got a lot of tentacles with the U.S. Army, and it's got an interest in all things U.S. Army. And then Mark Bowden, again, the best known name with this, associated with this battle for good reason, obviously had the ability to break the story open in the beginning. It has unprecedented access and tremendous context. So again, we wrote about it, Bob wrote about it, and I'm not sure if anybody else received it. And this may just be, we may have been the first couple to sort of open the door to others that want to get interested in it and do some research of their own.
Okay. I know in your article you talked about, and correct me if I'm wrong, the decision not to deploy armor to Somalia. Was there, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, was there also a request for AC-130 gunship support, and that was denied as well?
Yes, they were there. AC-130s had been there earlier when it was just the UN force that had basically quick reaction force responsibilities, the QRF, but they had been redeployed elsewhere, and the question on armor was also considered in the tank and with the Secretary of Defense, and the decision was made, as I recall, that putting in armor is just going to escalate it. So that was, again, I'm sort of reading between the lines and kind of connecting with what Meade's memo says. So that was the decision not to go big. So somebody, the Secretary of Defense ultimately approves those orders or disapproves them. The Secretary of Defense at the time, Les Aspin, disapproved it. And he had some recommendations from the uniforms to disapprove it, because again, you put in a lot of armor, you kind of entrenching yourself in there bigger and deeper. I mean, obviously you'd rather be hiding behind a tank or some kind of vehicle if you're getting shot at, but that was, I think, an effort not to be so we don't want to be there. We want to support the humanitarian effort, and we do not want to be everywhere doing everything. And that was the experience I had working in the Pentagon. Was, I would suggest it was a post-Cold War phenomenon. It hasn't changed now. During the Cold War, we were everywhere doing everything we could do just to make sure we didn't cede anything to the Soviet Union. And then when the Cold War ended and some of these threats ended, we had formations and capabilities and assets all over the globe, some of which may have not made that much sense anymore. So I have a hunch, again, trying to recall my time in the building then, so 30 plus years ago, that there was not an interest in establishing new outposts in random locations that weren't supporting some kind of larger strategic effort.
Okay. I guess, let's see, how did the U.S. intervention in Somalia affect U.S. doctrine in places such as Afghanistan? Was the experience in Somalia, studied and applied in Afghanistan?
I mean, very different situations, but the experiences in Somalia were studied in something connected with Afghanistan. There were some lessons that were learned, something that was started by Secretary of Defense, then James Mattis, on something that became called the Close Combat Lethality Task Force. And he, with the help of retired Major General Bob Scales, had been studying this since Mattis was at Joint Forces Command back in probably about 10 years after Somalia. They were trying to figure out how the U.S. military could better train and better support and empower its very frontline soldiers. Because in the course of U.S. history since World War II, about 80% of the killed in action come from the frontline infantry or armor, or the soldiers that accompany them, artillery, the medics, the engineers. Those are the people who, not surprisingly, have the highest casualty rate. But it's up to us to try to do something about that. And I think Madison scales were both of the mindset that we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars training a pilot to do a specific task or equipping them to do it better. And we're not spending virtually anything on an individual soldier. And we know which one's got a much higher probability of dying than the other one does when you do it over the whole course of the military. And not that they don't want to, give the pilot everything he or she needs, but some of the lessons and insights on what soldiers should carry on the equipment, what their weapons ought to be like, what their optics and their sights, night vision goggles, that fed into institutionally what the Office of Secretary of Defense oversaw. Now I know the Army's got what they call the Soldier Lethality Task Force. So how can soldiers be more lethal and more safe while doing their job? So again, but that was more of an institutional response to it. I don't know of anything specifically other than people studied this battle and the U.S. experience. I went to the Command and General Staff College from 1995 to 1996. So basically not a little more than a year after this. So this was a very hot emotional topic amongst the students, including some who had been in this battle. And everybody had their viewpoint. And again, collectively, the body of knowledge is increasing. General Meade's memo is just adding a little bit more for people to understand that.
Okay, I've got one last question, and that's what we're talking about Mark Bowden and his book Black Hawk Down, which I got an early edition, I think even before it was published, and read it. I think I read it in a day. That's what happens when you're a journalist, and try to think of. There's other ones like that who could write and do good military history. He actually did then he was invited to speak at AUSA not long after Black Hawk Down, and to this day is the best presentation I ever heard at AUSA, one of the best ones I've ever heard. The only time I ever saw him get a standing ovation at AUSA, it was very impressive. But what I wanted to ask you is, the film, how do you think that holds up?
I think the value in that is it tends to portray the experience at the soldier level. Well, some of it may, there's different stories that say, well, that wasn't exactly true.
Sure.
And again, I think that's natural anyway. So I don't have any heartburn with it. I think it conveyed vividly, some of the experiences that were occurring. And so it's not just some, again, boring sounding story of we thought one thing was going to happen and something else happened and we lost some people. I think each of these things, from the film to these YouTube videos I was talking about with those 3 or 4 people sitting around talking about it, I think they all kind of shine a little, something's accurate within that. And then other parts are either exaggerated or assumed. So I'm rambling a little bit, but I think they all add up to something interesting. Reading the book, reading the official AAR, again, may not be the most exciting, after act reports, may not be the most exciting thing, but for certain aspects of it, you get some useful information. Then reading press releases or articles about it from that time, that's kind of interesting, going back to read that. So I think they all add up to something. And again, the movie, again, if nothing else, if it captures someone's attention and they say, I need to learn more about that, then they pick up Bowden's book, or then they pick up Lechner's book, or get the AUSA graphic novel and go, okay, I can read about this in less than 10 minutes, and I will now know about that and 2 great Americans that willingly gave their lives to save their brothers. So I think just kind of keeping the interest alive has got a lot of merit.
Do you recall if any of these YouTube videos was Was Sergeant Eversman, is he one of the people that are featured in it?
He may have been, but it's a different mix. It wasn't the same cast of characters, although I've seen several of them in different things. And I think, you know, my suspicion is, and someone would have to talk to them directly, I think they enjoy it because they're commiserating with their brothers in arms from going through one of the worst days of their life. And they're still learning from each other. And like I said, it really was kind of humorous watching one where the one guy said, "No, you're crazy. That didn't happen." He said, "Yeah, it did. Yeah, you know." And the other guy said, "Yeah, he's right." And, which is, again, that's what old soldiers do, and it's kind of an interesting thing to do. I was in Israel about 6 years ago, and we were on the Golan Heights, talking through the Israeli 1973 war, and like a retired old battalion commander was describing what happened on the second morning or something. He's describing it in great detail, and this is mostly for a team that was over there visiting, but there were other people interested. And then another guy about the age of the gentleman that was talking to us said, "No, that's completely wrong. That did not happen at all." And there's one guy was a battalion commander in like 1st Battalion, the other guy was a platoon leader in 2nd Battalion, but they were like adjacent to each other on the Golan Heights, and they're still arguing it out. You know, like 50 years later, and said, "No, this is
The universal.
yeah." So again, I think all that is, no one's got a monopoly on the truth. They've got the monopoly on their perspective. If they can politely share them, there's a lot of good to be done.
I just want to add one last thing about when I said Sergeant Eversman, and if you recall in the film, he's portrayed by Josh Hartnett. Well, we had an intern here years ago who was an RTC cadet at Johns Hopkins, and Sergeant Eversman was an instructor, NCO instructor in their ROTC unit, and he asked him about that, and he grunted, you know, about Josh Hartnett, and he grunted and said, "Pretty boy." So that's all I have.
We have a few questions from viewers. Joseph Craig asks, what is the Army doing today to improve strategic thinking so we can avoid future defeats?
One of the initiatives that the current Chief of Staff, Randy George, has really leaned into is professional writing and professional reading associated with that. And it's to, again, encourage people who are in the profession of arms, in this case specifically the Army profession, to read, to write, you know, reflect on it, and write about their experiences of what they've read, and share it with others. Because again, just like the two old Israeli fighters on the hill, if they don't share it, nobody's benefiting from it. And the whole is better than the sum of the parts. So that is one of the things that's starting at the grassroots level, because everybody thinks strategy is just like the old generals and guys have been around forever. Now, they're the ones that more often interact at the strategic level, but strategic thinking needs to start earlier, and people need to live it and practice it. And I think, again, this professional writing is a great way to do it, because if one's being honest with themselves, they're writing about something that they might not know all there is to know about it. So it's discovering the broader context. And I've heard some people that I consider great strategists describe that you're not solving a problem. And the answer to your problem is in the same situation that the problem is, obviously. And it's understanding how different things interact together. And it's people being humble enough through things like educational experiences or attempting to write about something bigger than themselves, that we start to exercise that muscle group. And it's not just study the cliff notes and then and one will be a strategist. Thanks for the question, Joe.
Our next question is from Paul. He asks, do you see any current global scenarios that are likely to become the next mission creep / Mogadishu?
It's a great question. And it's, again, one of the other things that came out of this was many problems we have stem from solutions to previous problems that we solved. And if one could take, so one could talk about support to Ukraine, say, okay, well, so what's the answer? Do we go big? Do we stay? Or do we go small? Essentially the options that General Meade was laying out. Okay, so General Meade did a great job of articulating what he thought of those three options. None of them had good outcomes. So that's the question that the senior people need to understand, people who make the decisions need to understand, based on input from people like General Meade, who was on the ground. And again, the fact that he didn't know everything about it was almost to his advantage. I mean, he was a smart guy and had the broad picture, and in 48 hours gets a deep focused look at what's happening right in front of him and what it probably means. And I think this is the art of, the question you ask is more important than the answer. It's sort of like, and again, I can't remember if it was Voltaire or somebody who said that judge a man not by his answers, but by his questions, or some version of that. I'm sure he's rolling over in his grave right now because I don't think I quite did it justice. But yeah, I don't have an answer. I'd say that whoever has got to deal with that needs to really interrogate the situation from as many perspectives as they can before they make a recommendation. Because the answer is, are they out there? Yes, there are definitely situations like that, but it depends on getting into the real nuts and bolts of that. And I couldn't answer that generically, other than, yeah, we need to check that out.
Okay. Thank you, Colonel. Would you like to give any closing remarks?
I think this has been a great topic, and even just digging into it again or rereading an article I wrote a couple of years ago, the other contexts help build one's perspective on this, and trying to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. Like in this case, General Meade gave us a view of what it looked like from his shoes. That was an invaluable opportunity. And like I said, the quote I close with from Faulkner, the past is never dead. It's not even past. I mean, again, it sounds like a T-shirt or some poster somebody's got on their wall, and it probably is. But it's also the lesson that whatever is going on, it's meaningful and important. There's something that caused it to be that way, or at least enabled it to be an outcome. And sometimes I think we're a little too focused on, oh, there's a problem, oh, I'm going to solve it. And then there's another problem, I can solve that quickly. And then what winds up happening is people are creating new problems, but they don't, intellectually, they don't care, because it's like, my job is to solve this little thing without understanding more broadly that there's going to be consequences. And this what we're seeing with al-Qaida and all its entities to which it's morphed into, and there'll be more that are coming, is drawing some of the energy intellectually and emotionally and psychologically from this incident in Mogadishu and others. Again, this wasn't the only thing that's ever happened. It's got many different threads to it. So again, I just think this is a good case study to humble ourselves, to say this just isn't that easy to figure out. It takes a lot of intellectual work to get there.
Okay. I want to thank Colonel Roper for being with us tonight. I think this was a very enlightening discussion on a topic I think many of us remember well. And it was definitely a momentous occasion. It just, like I said, I think it's still with us today. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and we hope you enjoyed the program.
Thank you for watching our Writing Awards series. If you like this episode, please click like and subscribe. You can also find more Army history and support the Foundation at our website at www.armyhistory.org. Thank you.